The voice was gone, not gradually, not in the slow erosion that Ella had always privately feared, the slow narrowing of range, the incremental loss of the high notes, the kind of decline that you could see coming and prepare for. That wasn't what happened. What happened was a Tuesday morning in March 1971 when Ella woke up and her voice was wrong, not gone entirely. She could still produce sound. But the sound was wrong, rough in places it shouldn't have been rough, missing in places where the sound should have been full, caught on something that resisted when she tried to push through to certain notes. She told herself it was rest, it was fatigue. The touring schedule had been brutal as it always was. She needed sleep and quiet and a few days off. She gave herself 3 days and the voice didn't improve. She went to her doctor, Doctor referred her to a specialist, a throat surgeon whose practice in Los Angeles served many performers and who had the particular knowledge and precision that voices required. The surgeon examined her, was careful and quiet during the examination. Afterward, he asked Ella to sit and he sat across from her and he told her what he'd found: vocal cord nodules. Common in professional singers, the result of years of high-volume use, of performing multiple nights a week, of the particular strain that amplified performance placed on the delicate structures of the throat. They could develop slowly over years without causing problems until they reached a size where they couldn't be ignored. Ella's had reached that size. Can they be removed? She asked. Yes, the surgeon said. The surgery is standard. We've done it many times, and after. He paused. She noticed the pause. After surgery, you'll need a period of complete vocal rest. No speaking, no whispering if possible. Even whispering puts strain on the cords during healing. Complete silence for several weeks. Several weeks, 4 to 6, minimum. Ella absorbed this. And when I come back, when I can use my voice again, there's no guarantee, the surgeon said carefully. In most cases, singers who undergo this surgery recover well. Their voices return to full function or close to it. In some cases, there's some change in range or quality. In rare cases, Ella prompted, in rare cases, the voice doesn't fully recover. There can be scarring, or the cords may not return to optimal function. He paused again. I want to be honest with you. The surgery has good outcomes. The majority of the time, but I can't promise you that your voice will be exactly what it was before. Ella looked at him. She was 53 years old. She had been singing professionally for 37 years. She had been singing in churches, on street corners, in school hallways, in her mother's apartment for almost as long as she could remember. She could not remember a version of herself that didn't sing. The voice was not something she had. It was something she was. And if I don't have the surgery, she asked, the nodules will continue to cause problems. Your range will continue to narrow. Performing will become increasingly difficult and eventually impossible. He looked at her steadily. You need the surgery, Miss Fitzgerald. The question is not whether, but when. She drove home alone. She sat in her car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Then she called Norman Grants. Norman had been her manager for 17 years by 1971. In those 17 years, he had managed crises, booking problems, venue issues, travel disasters, the inevitable complications of a major touring artist's life. He had seen Ella face difficulties with the particular combination of grace and stubbornness that was her characteristic response to problems. She'd never called him with anything like this. She told him what the surgeon had said. She told it simply, without drama, in the flat, factual way she presented things that were too large for ordinary emotional processing. Nodules, surgery, 4 to 6 weeks of silence. No guarantee the voice would fully return. Norman was quiet for a long moment. When do they want to do the surgery? He asked. As soon as possible, he said. Waiting won't make it better. Then we schedule it as soon as possible. Norman, Ella, there's no other option here. You know that. I know that. She paused. I needed to say it out loud to someone before I have to start being okay about it. You don't have to be okay about it yet, Norman said. You can call me every day until the surgery and not be okay about it. After the surgery, after the voice comes back, then you can be okay about it. And if it doesn't come back, Norman was silent for a beat that was slightly too long. Then we figure out what comes next, he said, but I don't think we're going to need to figure that out. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. Norman canceled Ella's upcoming performances quietly through the standard channels with explanations of scheduling issues and prior commitments that gave nothing away. Ella Fitzgerald had throat surgery in Los Angeles in the 3rd week of March 1971, and the music industry didn't know, and the public didn't know, and the only people present were the surgical team and Norman waiting in the hospital corridor. When Ella woke from the anesthesia, the first thing she did, by reflex involuntarily, before conscious thought had fully reassembled, was try to make a sound. She couldn't in the way she'd feared, not the silence of damage or failure. Couldn't because of the surgical swelling, because of the bandaging, because the throat had just been opened and closed and was doing what throats do after surgery. She understood this intellectually. The surgeon had explained what the immediate post-operative period would feel like. But knowing didn't make the silence less frightening. The weeks of mandated vocal rest were the strangest of Ella Fitzgerald's life. She was not a person who used silence by choice. She talked, she hummed, she sang absent-mindedly around the house, she vocalized while cooking or reading or doing the ordinary things of daily life. Sound was as natural to her as breathing. More natural in some ways, breathing she never thought about, but she was always aware of the music she was making or not making. Now she was not making any. The surgeon had been specific, not speaking, not whispering, not humming. If she needed to communicate, she could write. She kept a small notepad with her at all times and a pen, and she wrote out what she needed to say, short, practical communications, because writing was slow, and you learned quickly to say only what was essential. What she couldn't write was what she was feeling. She couldn't write about the fear, the specific, physical, constant fear of a person who cannot hear their own voice and doesn't know whether it still exists. She couldn't write about what it was like to stand in the kitchen making coffee and hear the ordinary sounds of the house, the refrigerator, the street outside, the small sounds of other people's lives going on normally, and to be silent in the middle of all of that. She couldn't write about the particular quality of isolation that comes from not speaking, the way that silence creates a kind of glass between you and other people. She couldn't write about the dreams. In the dreams she could sing, not just sing but sing exactly as she always had, the full range and power and control of a voice at its best. In the dreams there was no surgery, and no recovery and no uncertainty, only the voice as it had always been. She would wake from these dreams into the silence of the room and lie still and understand, again, that it was morning and she still could not make a sound. She couldn't write about the particular cruelty of music in this period. She still heard it everywhere, on the radio, on television, the recordings she had made that were still being played. Her own voice coming out of speakers, sounding exactly as it had before all of this. The voice she might not have anymore, playing in her own house, preserved in recordings that would outlast whatever happened to the living version. She turned the radio off. She stopped listening to her own albums. Norman came every day. He sat with her for an hour or two and didn't require her to communicate anything she didn't need to communicate. He talked when there was something useful to say and was quiet when there wasn't. He understood that his job in this period was not to fix anything or to manage anything, but simply to be present. He brought food sometimes, or flowers or newspapers. Once he brought a crossword puzzle book and they worked on a puzzle together for an hour in comfortable silence, communicating only in occasional small gestures, a raised eyebrow, a pointed finger, a shrug. They had known each other for 17 years. They had a vocabulary of gestures that covered a lot of ground. On the days when the fear was the worst, the days when she woke up and the silence felt permanent rather than temporary, she would write him one question on her notepad. It was always the same question, though she varied the phrasing slightly. Do you think it's still there? Norman knew what it meant. He always answered the same way. Yes, I think it's still there. It just needs time. She didn't fully believe him, but the certainty with which he said it helped, and the fact that he kept coming back day after day, sitting with her in the silence without requiring anything from her, that helped too, in the way that presence helps when there's nothing to be done except wait. 6 weeks after the surgery, the end of the mandated silence, the moment she'd been counting toward since she woke up in the recovery room, she was alone in her bedroom early in the morning. She had woken before anyone else. The house was quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed. She tried to make a sound. What came out was small, a whisper, barely audible. The rough, uncertain sound of a voice that hadn't been used in 6 weeks, that was cautious of itself, that didn't yet know what it was capable of. But it was there. She tried again, slightly more sound this time. The roughness was still there. The surgeon had warned her the first weeks of the voice returning would sound different from what she was used to, that it would need to be carefully exercised back to full function. She sang one note, middle C, roughly, soft, careful, unadorned. It was not Ella Fitzgerald's voice, not yet. It was a shadow of it, an outline, something that might become that voice with work and time and care. But it was there. She sat on the edge of her bed in the early morning and let the tears come in silence, which was something she'd learned to do well in the previous 6 weeks. She called Norman, not to say anything. She still had weeks of careful rehabilitation ahead before she should be talking freely, let alone singing. She just called, and when he answered, she made one small, rough sound. He knew what it meant. "I told you," he said. The rehabilitation was long and careful. She worked with a vocal coach who specialized in post-surgical voice recovery, doing exercises so gentle they felt insulting to someone who had been performing at the highest level for 37 years. Single notes, soft and slow, one at a time. Scales and half steps that crept up the range with infinite caution. Some days were better than others. Some mornings the voice felt like it was returning to something recognizable, and some mornings it felt like a stranger's voice, limited and unreliable and nothing like what she needed it to be. She did not tell anyone about any of this, not her wider circle of friends and colleagues, not the music press, not the public, who had been told only that she'd had some scheduling issues requiring a break from touring. Nobody outside a small circle of absolutely necessary people, Norman, the surgeon, the vocal coach, knew what was actually happening. She refused to let the story become public property. Her voice, her surgery, her recovery, these were hers, not the public's, not the industry's, not material for anyone else's narrative about what Ella Fitzgerald was or wasn't. When she was ready, when the voice had been rebuilt to the point where she could trust it on a stage, could trust it not to fail her in front of an audience who had paid to hear it, she booked a concert. The booking was announced simply: Ella Fitzgerald performing at a major venue in Los Angeles, August 1971. A homecoming show, as it was billed. Tickets sold out within days because they always did. Nobody who bought a ticket knew what they were attending. They thought they were going to an Ella Fitzgerald concert, which they were, but they didn't know they were attending a first performance after a surgery that could have ended everything, after months of silence and fear and careful rebuilding of the thing that defined her. They didn't know what had happened backstage on that Tuesday morning in March. They didn't know about the surgeon's warning. They didn't know about the silence. They didn't know about the notepad or Norman's daily visits or the dreams where she could sing. They didn't know about the middle C whispered alone in a bedroom at 6 in the morning or the tears that followed it. They didn't know about the vocal exercises, so simple they were almost childlike, or the weeks of careful rehabilitation, or the mornings when the voice felt like a stranger's. They knew only that there had been some scheduling issues requiring a brief break from touring, and that Ella Fitzgerald was back. In the wings before the show, Ella stood in the darkness with Norman beside her, and was more frightened than she'd been since standing in the Apollo wings in 1934, and deciding at the last moment to sing rather than dance. Not ordinary pre-performance nerves, not the controlled alertness of a professional who has learned to use nerves as fuel. Something deeper and more fundamental. She was afraid that when she opened her mouth, the voice would not be there. Not rationally afraid. The rehabilitation had been going well. The vocal coach was satisfied. The voice during practice sessions was sounding like itself again. The rational evidence suggested it would be fine, but rational evidence and the body's fear are different things, and the body remembers what it means to reach for something essential and find it gone. The body doesn't entirely trust that what was restored will stay restored, at least not yet, at least not until it has been tested in the specific way that performing is a test, live in public, with the whole weight of what Ella Fitzgerald meant to audiences riding on whether the voice did what it was supposed to do. "Are you ready?" Norman asked quietly. She thought about this. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." He nodded. "Good enough." She walked onto the stage. The audience applauded with the warmth of people welcoming back someone they'd missed, who perhaps had been missed more than they'd consciously registered until she appeared. She stood at the microphone, the lights, the expectant quiet of a full house. She opened her mouth and she sang. The voice that came out was Ella Fitzgerald's voice. Not the voice of the previous February, not the voice before the nodules had announced themselves on that Tuesday morning in March. A slightly different voice in ways she could hear and was certain most others couldn't, marginally changed in certain high notes, different in small qualities of texture and resonance, but it was her voice, recognizably, unmistakably, powerfully hers. The audience heard Ella Fitzgerald performing beautifully. They heard exactly what they'd come for. They had no idea. She sang for 2 hours. She sang with the particular gratitude of someone who understands, in a way that audiences and critics cannot, what is required to be standing on this stage in this moment making this sound. She did not tell them what the night meant to her. She received their applause and their standing ovation, and she bowed with the grace she always brought to these moments, and she walked off the stage, and she stood in the wings, and she did not perform the composure of someone for whom this was normal. The comeback nobody knew was a comeback, because that was what she chose, to keep the stakes of the thing private, to let it exist as her own knowledge of what had been risked and what had been recovered, rather than as a public story of triumph. She kept singing for another 25 years, through deteriorating health and changing voice, and the inevitable diminishment that time brought to every physical instrument. Through the 1970s and 1980s and into the 1990s, when diabetes took her eyesight and her legs gave her trouble, and the voice was different from what it had once been, but still recognizably hers. Nobody in those audiences knew about March 1971, about the Tuesday morning when the voice went wrong, about the surgery and the silence and the middle C whispered in an early morning bedroom and the tears that followed it. They just heard Ella Fitzgerald, and she was still there. She had fought to be there in the private way that some fights are conducted, not with announcement, not with the public heroism of a narrative anyone can cheer for, but in the quiet, daily, unglamorous work of holding on to what matters and refusing to let go of it, even when letting go would be the easier thing. The comeback nobody knew was a comeback. That was in some ways the most Ella Fitzgerald thing about it. She'd been proving things to herself quietly her whole life. The rest of the world could see the results. The work was hers.